Okay, so MPoC mobile updates. I'm going to be talking about our new MPoC Standard, the new updates that we're making to that, and also some of the updates around other standards we're making in terms of mobile. That's me. Who doesn't know me? All right, so let's move on. So when we talk about mobile acceptance, it's kind of important to understand how we got to where we are right now. So I've been in payments for longer than I care to admit, which is why I have a lot of grey in my beard. But when we started off in acceptance, when I started off working in payments, a PIN entry device was literally a PIN entry device. It was a physical device that was used to enter your PIN on. Sometimes it didn't even have a magnetic stripe on, although often it did. It almost certainly never had a chip card reader in, or if it did have a chip card reader, then that chip card reader wouldn't be EMV compliant at that point, I would imagine. We have requirements around that. We had the PCI PED program at that point. This is, back in the kind of 2004 days when PCI PED was first released. Those devices evolved over time. People wanted more. They didn't just want to have something that they entered a PIN on. They wanted something that did more things. So it wasn't just a PIN entry device anymore. It became a point of interaction, something that you used to make a payment, but you did other things with as well. And that, in turn, evolved in terms of, well, maybe we can do the PIN entry on a touchscreen rather than a physical keypad. Or you know what? Maybe we don't need PIN at all because people are increasingly using contactless and they don't have CVM, and maybe we just need a dedicated card reader out the side. So we have a standard for that, and that's PTS POI. But that multifunction PED, that kind of PED in the middle there, that evolved in a different way as well. That evolved into mobile devices being used to accept payments. Because fundamentally, the change here was we were going from a device where payment was its reason for being. Payment wasn't a function, it was a purpose. That's what it did. That was what it was designed for. That was the only thing it did. And what we're moving to now, and we're moving through at the moment, is payment as a function. Payment is something that underlies other abilities that these systems have that they're going to be used for. And so those multifunction PEDs, they evolved one way into terminals, but they also evolved into applications that run on consumer off-the-shelf devices. And we have standards for that. SPoC, CPoC, MPoC is the one I'm certainly going to be talking about today. So with MPoC, we released the standard initially, version 1.0, that got released in November of 2022. We released the program guide a month or so after that. We had a minor update to MPoC released in February of 2023, and as needed, as required, we have been releasing FAQs, technical FAQs, to help update questions people have on the standard and so forth. But we keep on getting feedback. We're still getting feedback about this standard. And that feedback has been, well, you know what? It's great, but going through the laboratory tests every time we make updates to an application, having requirements around going through multiple standards, that's very burdensome. We're hearing feedback that people wanted to use different types of POI devices. Version 1.0.1 of MPoC was constrained, limited to a particular type of POI device called an SCRP. People wanted to use different types of POI device. We're having feedback that there were multiple ways in which people wanted to deploy MPoC products, that the program and the standard weren't necessarily accommodating in a good way. So different types of product types that they wanted to have supported. Some people saw some of the requirements we had in there as unnecessary for the kind of threat landscape and the reason that MPoC was existing to help secure payments on mobile devices. Some of the key management requirements were a little bit too strict, potentially. And there's an ongoing discussion when we say commercial off-the-shelf device, COTS device, what exactly does that mean? What is the definition of that? And we have a definition in version 1.0.1. People were saying that was too restrictive. So we wanted to hear more of this feedback. We were hearing this anecdotally. We were getting it from meetings like this. We were getting it from customers who are working with labs, who are feeding information through from the labs. We're hearing it from our stakeholder groups like our BOA and so forth. But we wanted to make sure that we heard the information as much as possible from as wide a possible community group as we could. So we had meetings, a number of meetings that we set up from May through to August with our MTF, our Mobile Task Force, which is set up from people who are participating organizations who are interested in mobile technologies, as well as the TGG, or the Technology Guidance Group, who is part of our principal participating organization groups. And they met with us online, and we talked about the current version of MPoC. And we talked about, here are the changes that we think might work. And we got feedback dynamically as we were working to help us not only understand what the problems were, but also help us understand what the solutions to those problems could be. And the outcome of that is we had an RFC, and that RFC ran in parallel with these meetings. So as well as the meetings, we were gaining information through our RFC process. And here, what we have categorized, we had about 400 pieces of information that were provided through the RFC. And here is a categorization of the feedback we received, where the different colors indicates a different entity that provided that piece of information. So this helps us understand that, okay, there's a lot of information on the very large bar there. That's basically wording, where we've worded something in a way that people didn't like. Maybe there was a typo, maybe there was some error in the way things was written. But also, if we look at some of the other ones, they're not so big, but if every single company has provided an item of feedback there, it's obviously something that's really important to the stakeholder groups. So we went through that RFC, and we went through a disposition of that. Every single item of feedback we received, we looked at, we discussed internally, and we decided what we could do with that piece of information, that feedback. Can we make a change? Can we not make a change? And what is the reason for that? So RFC process, the meetings with our MTF, the meetings with the TGG, we heard all of this feedback, we heard information on how we can actually make the changes. And so with that, we're looking at releasing a new version of MPoC relatively soon, I would say within the space of this year. And those changes that we're making, listed up on the screen here. So, changes. We're allowing in version MPoC version 1.1 apps to integrate an isolating SDK, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means later on, to be validated directly by the vendor, so you don't have that process of necessarily always going back to the laboratory. We've changed the MPoC product types. Where there used to be an MPoC A&M service, there's now an MPoC service that could provide A&M being attestation and monitoring. It helps secure the device. It could be also attestation, monitoring, and payments, so it can provide for more options around white labeling. We allow for one MPoC SDK to integrate another MPoC SDK. We allow for there to be an SDK that has the application provide the secure channel to the payment backend so that it can support different acquirers more easily. We removed some of the requirements, which includes removal of secure software validation, which was one of the requirements that we were hearing was too burdensome. And we also took all of those technical FAQs that we had, that we'd built up over the last 2 years, thereabouts, a little bit less, and we baked those directly into the standard so you didn't have these multiple documents to look at. And finally, of course, We discussed further the definition of COTS, and we provided an update to that as well. So here, the difference is very subtle, and I'll work through some of those subtleties both on this slide and later. You can see that, broadly it does the same thing. We're not changing the fundamentals of what MPoC is with MPoC version 1.1. What we are doing, though, is we're allowing for different types of POIs. And so that means that you can have pin entry not only on your COTS device, you can potentially have pin entry on your external POI device as well, because SCRPs, the type of POI device that was supported in version 1.0.1, that does not have a pin entry function. Different types of POIs do. So you can now enter your pin in different ways in these systems. You can have different applications that integrate multiple SDKs, where an SDK might contain another SDK as well, and that can be validated through what we call vendor verification, not necessarily the application going through a lab. So what does all this mean for product development or product deployment scenarios? On this slide, there's kind of some high-level features that we would expect to see in any kind of MPoC implementation. You've got your software that lives on your COTS device, on your mobile device. You have your A&M software that sits in the back end. You have some processes in terms of vulnerability management and key management. You have some services, like your attestation and monitoring service. Once again, that service that helps secure the COTS environment. You've got a payment function, because that's literally what it's all about, mobile payment on COTS. So a payment switch has to exist, or a payment acquirer has to exist at some point. And then you've got the applications that are actually being used. Ultimately, then, you also have acquirers. So what we haven't changed is you can do all of that in what we call a monolithic context. You can say, I want to do MPoC, and you meet all of the requirements. As somebody who's creating a system, you meet all of those requirements, you build it up, you can still do that, no problem. MPoC software, key management. Now, if we're looking at version 1.0.1, an MPoC software was a very specific thing. And you could build an A&M service in a very specific way. And then you could build a solution on top of that. But once again, in a very specific way. They're relatively constrained. In version 1.1, what we're saying is, well, software, okay, you can have your COTS-based software and so forth, vulnerability management, key management, all in there. But when you have a service, you might have a service that does attestation and monitoring, yes, but you can also have a service that includes the software. That was not something we allowed in version 1.0.1 of MPoC. If you were going to build out a service, it had to be built on top of an existing MPoC software product. In version 1.1, you can build out a service and have that listed as including, essentially, the software product itself. But you can also have a service that's an A&M and payment service that includes the attestation and monitoring, but also the payment side of the functions there as well. You can build a solution on top of those systems, and that solution doesn't necessarily have to include acquiring, and it can be built on top of an MPoC software and an MPoC service. Or you can have a solution that does include the acquirers as well. It gives you different options for these systems to coexist. So I've been talking about SDKs and integration, so what does all that mean? In version 1.0.1 of MPoC, we did allow for an application to integrate two SDKs, but they had to be completely separate, had to be completely isolated, essentially, from each other. And they would have different payment backends, different A&M backends, these sorts of things. In version 1.1, we allow for one MPoC SDK, in this context, MPoC SDK 2, to integrate another MPoC SDK, in this context, MPoC SDK 1. And then all of that can then be integrated into an MPoC application. And that allows, for example, for different use cases that I'll go through in a minute. They also can implement different backends. You might have SDK1 having an A&M, SDK2 having a payment backend. They would both need to have A&M functions built into them, but one might be provided by the other, potentially. You can have MPoC SDK2, the one that is integrating the other MPoC SDK in this context, providing non-payment functions. Now, what do I mean by that? As an example, let's say you have a system where you want to deploy a device to read transport tickets. And maybe you want to build an SDK that's going to read transport tickets. Doesn't have anything to do with payments. You're going to be reading transport tickets with this system. But you also want to potentially make a payment or accept a payment with that if the transport ticket needs updating, whatever it is. So you might say, here is MPoC SDK1. It does payments. That's fantastic. I want to integrate that into my MPoC SDK2 that is going to read transport tickets. It contacts a non-payment backend, and that's all possible within MPoC version 1.1. And there are differences in how that can be evaluated. So there are some scenarios here with SDKs where you will still need to have the application or the integrating system being validated through a lab. And ultimately, if you're adding MPoC-relevant functionality, when you integrate something, then that is going to have to be validated by a laboratory. So if you're adding payment functionality, if you're adding new types of payment acceptance functions, if you're adding PIN where it didn't support PIN anymore, PIN before, these things would need to be validated through a lab. If instead the only thing you're adding is something like that transport ticket function in the SDK, SDK2 in this context, that would be where you could go through what we call vendor verification in that context, where the vendor of SDK1 would be able to verify that you've integrated it correctly and submit that for listing in the, on the website. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a PCI presentation unless I said there's going to be some context where it depends, and it's going to depend on exactly what the implementation is, where the middle ground is. We're not always going to be able to clearly define in the context of the standard, this side is that way, this side is that way. There's always going to be some middle ground, and so there's always going to be somewhere where there needs to be potentially a discussion with a lab or somebody else to understand the context there. So, very simply, if it's not relevant to MPoC requirements, if you're integrating something and that integration isn't adding anything that impacts or changes the functionality that has been previously assessed, that can go through vendor testing from an integration of an existing SDK point of view. If it is relevant, if you're making MPoC relevant changes, if you're implementing, changing, or impacting any of the functions that were previously assessed, then that would need to go through lab testing. And then, there's the middle ground. So we're trying to provide as much flexibility as we can while still making sure we're meeting the intent of providing security around payments in that COTS environment. So where are we going to go from here? So MPoC version 1.1 is currently going through finalization. We expect that to be released later this year. Not just that, we're also working on the program guide, the associated program documentation, so the reporting documentation, the submittal documentation, these sorts of things. We're working on all of that, and we expect that to hopefully be released by the end of this year as well. So look out for that. However, MPoC is not everything. Now, this is a genuine picture of me before I shave in the morning. I was very shocked when I found out that MPoC wasn't everything as well, so I understand your shock. We are working on other mobile aspects as well. We're looking at an SDK module for secure software that is going to support things such as 3S SDK and tap to pay on your own phone, not a merchant's phone, potentially. There's a lot happening right now, and as I mentioned, if you saw my presentation yesterday, seems like a long time ago, we really need your input. And what I would like to say is, this is what your input does for us. This picture here is an indication of the changes that were made between MPoC version 1.0.1 to MPoC 1.1. Now, you can't actually read it, of course, but everywhere we see a red line or a crossout or something like that, that's a change that's been made in the standard between version 1.0.1 and 1.1. And every one of those changes was based on feedback that we received through the RFC process, through the meetings that we had. And if you want to have impact, if you want to have influence, if you are interested in any of our standards, and you wouldn't be at this conference if you weren't interested in any of our standards, we need you to provide that input so that we can continue our mission to help secure payments into the future. So thank you very much.